he's sort of exposed a real shocker here, hasn't he, Nigel Farage? He's become an unlikely hero for banking customers.
Yes, he certainly, I think, is positioning himself as an unlikely hero for banking customers. I mean, it's certainly the case that this subject access report that he's got out of Coutts, kind of all the information it had on him that it's had to hand over, is ugly reading for Farage. It, as you say, it mentions all sorts of things, certainly Brexit. There's talk of concerns about xenophobia. There's all sorts of things that the Coutts people raise as potential concerns about Nigel Farage as a customer. But the document itself is quite confused and isn't really a sort of consistent view on why Coutts got rid of Nigel Farage. It sort of talks about lots of different things. It contradicts itself in different ways. And it also does talk about his kind of commercial worth to the bank. And so it's not really completely clear why actually he was, to use the jargon, debanked. And as you know very well, it's led to an enormous row about whether it was for commercial reasons, and there's been some briefing potentially out of the bank. It's not clear where it's come from, that indeed it was commercial reasons. But then at the same time, there's plenty of people out there saying, no, that was not the real reason. It was all these political views and views that Coutts views to be inconsistent with its own purpose and image.
Yeah, so but we know that largely the document reveals his accounts were closed because his views did not align with Coutts. I just wonder how commonplace this is. Do banks akin to Coutts, or perhaps banks that are more popular with the wide populace, that banks are more popular with the everyday working person, like NatWest, whether it is common for someone to have this extent of information on their customer?
So I think it's very uncommon. I think that Coutts, of course, is a private bank, and so it's very normal for private banks to do more due diligence on their customers. That's because private bank customers, many of them are just completely straightforward people, but they have a higher number than bigger banks, more high street banks, of customers who might be potentially problematic. There's been talk about these politically exposed people accounts, the PEP accounts. Nigel Farage is a PEP. Those accounts require more due diligence. Private banks can attract obviously wealthier, sometimes overseas customers. That does mean that those private banks do more due diligence on their customers. And that certainly, as we've seen, is the case with Nigel Farage. When it comes to other customers, the millions of us who have accounts, normal, straightforward accounts, banks do try to monitor people in a broad sense. It's part of their regulatory responsibilities, in a sense. That is, they are meant, as well as, of course, law enforcement bodies, to try and pick up any kind of illegal activity. So that does mean they do broadly monitor people. They do look at social media and other things, but on the whole, it's not at all normal for them to go into this kind of detail about people. They just couldn't. It's millions and millions of people.
Yeah. Dame Alison Rose is the head of NatWest Bank, which owns Coutts. He's said today that she should be hauled in front of MPs to be questioned on whether she has a social agenda. Do you think Alison Rose's position here, this has happened under her watch, is it untenable, Katherine?
I think it's a really big call to think that this situation could potentially lead to the resignation of Alison Rose, but certainly she is in a very serious situation. This problem with Nigel Farage and his Coutts account, of course, has been rumbling now for a little while. I think probably, firstly, NatWest, I imagine, was quite keen to contain the issue within Coutts. That hasn't worked. And I think, today, some days after the subject access request information came out, only now Alison Rose and NatWest has sort of issued this apology and talked about a full review. They obviously aren't very keen to take the issue any further. They're clearly hoping it's going to kind of go away. I think it's not clear whether it's going to go away. Farage, of course, has lots and lots of supporters and other people who aren't necessarily sympathetic to his own views, but certainly take the view that, democratically people should be allowed to speak out. David Davis, for example, in Parliament yesterday talked about Alison Rose's position as being very serious and talked about the banking license. If there's a real sense in which NatWest as a company and its banking license could be attacked, I don't think there's any sense in which the license is going to be taken away. But then you get into the realms of NatWest's investors and how they feel. And of course, one of the ironies of this situation is that actually the government owns almost 40% of NatWest, back from when the government had to bail out NatWest, Royal Bank of Scotland, as it was then called, in 2008. So there are lots of complexities. But then there's a contrary view, which is people certainly on social media say, for goodness sake, don't waste government time, don't waste parliamentary time getting Alison Rose in to talk about one person's bank account. There's people out there saying that there's a deep irony in talking about this as being a financial inclusion issue when you've got, hundreds of thousands of people who are genuinely financially excluded from the banking system and whose lives are materially poorer as a result. So there are different views out there.